It's emperors like these that get the glory for building Rome. In reality, it was the soldiers from across the empire that labored to build its wonders. In this short film, we'll learn what those men's lives were like as they conquered Britannia and in turn affected our lives forever. The Roman conquest of Britannia left a legacy of government, social, military, and literary norms we recognize today. It began in 43 AD when the Emperor Claudius first invaded the island. Each of these orange dots represents a Roman fort. Over time, a complex network of fortifications, roads, and economies were built across Britain. And each of these forts was guarded by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Roman soldiers. And so began the long and bloody conquest to control people, trade, routes, and resources. And then the Emperor Hadrian did a curious thing. He had Roman soldiers build a stone wall from one side of the island to the next to show the power of Rome and mark its territory. In this map, you can see the thin white line that marks what would become known as Hadrian's Wall, and it was Roman soldiers who built, guarded, and defended this wall in forts such as Vindolanda. It was the Emperor Hadrian who understood that rather than continue to expand the empire, it was time to consolidate and regroup to defend the borders they already had from violent invaders. The wall in Britannia was part of this plan to mark the edge of the empire and keep out the rebellious Scottish tribes who refused to bend the knee. In 6 short years, soldiers built a stone wall 73 miles long and 15 feet high from hand-carved stones. It was in large part from the vast global trade network that taxes were collected by Rome to fund large projects such as this one. We often hear about the great marble buildings in Rome, but that was just a small corner of this global empire. We have to remember that some of the most special projects that have survived nearly 2,000 years are in much more humble surroundings. Hadrian's Wall still stands today, but it takes a bit of hunting to find it. On this small and unassuming path, with a charming gate and fields of sheep, we can climb the steep hill and see it for ourselves. This landscape is much as it was all those centuries ago. And as we take that final step to reach the summit, we see the result of untold hours of labor by Roman soldiers. This wall wasn't built by emperor or kings. It was built with hand-carved stones by soldiers from Italy, Africa, Greece, Britannia, Afghanistan, Spain, and so many others. And this is as close as we can get to reaching out and connecting with them. These are the same stones they touched, the same horizon they saw, and the same ground they walked on. This is the legacy of countless anonymous men who left us something phenomenal. Now that we have a bit of backstory and have seen one of the great wonders Roman soldiers have built, let's take a look at what the lives of these fascinating men were like. We'll discover why they entered the army, learn what training consisted of, we'll see the mental scars left by constant brutal violence, and see one of the best remaining forts near Hadrian's Wall that is still under excavation today, Vindolanda. The Roman army was a professional fighting force with paid soldiers, something we think of as normal today, but 2,000 years ago, Rome's soldiers were originally the elite, wealthy Italian citizens themselves. Because of their wealth, they paid for their own armor and weapons, and this strategy worked relatively well for quite some time. But Rome's expansion and success were double-edged swords. Businessmen and farmers, who had been the original soldiers, watched their crops and businesses fail while they were away fighting season after season. So the requirements changed to allow men with less property to become soldiers and for longer periods. Eventually, 5 classes of ordinary property-owning citizens were allowed to join. But eventually, even this strategy couldn't produce enough soldiers for Rome's expansion. And then something interesting happened. Gaius Marius, a celebrated and very popular politician and military commander with a knack for unusual ideas, began recruiting volunteers to join. These men were often the rural and urban poor, men who previously would not have been able to join. And since they didn't have money of their own, Marius had their armor and weapons paid for by the Roman state. It was the beginning of what we now recognize as a paid military, and it opened the doors for the poor, those captured in battle, and people in all levels of society to increase their social and financial status in a way that hadn't existed previously. Before this, most men's fate was sealed at birth. Now, men could enter the army poor and leave as soldiers with citizenship, property, and money. But the golden ticket was a military diploma given to auxiliary soldiers after 25 years of service, awarding Roman citizenship to not just him, but his wife and his children. These soldiers came from the far reaches of the empire, including areas we now know as Spain, Turkey, Africa and Afghanistan, Syria, Germany, France, and Britain. Many of these men were chosen for their specialty skills, like archery and horse riding. The goal of many entering the army was the promise of this better life, but it came with a tough entry standard and harsh conditions for long periods of time. Being accepted into the army meant passing several tests like health and dental examinations, measurements of their arms, legs, torsos, even their hands to ensure appropriate proportions and the ability to pass the grueling physical feats. For new recruits, training was particularly intense. Whatever the weather, whatever the time of day, however they felt, they would be out training twice a day. Observers of the day reported training sessions they witnessed of soldiers who were essentially involved in brutal battles without the enemy every day. And when soldiers moved to a new territory, observers were shocked to see soldiers arrive by the hundreds, and rather than set up camp after walking 20 to 30 miles, they immediately began digging deep and wide ditches to mark the boundaries of the camp. Then they built walls of wood behind those ditches, and then, and only then, did they begin to set up their tents in organized groups. Now, an important part of a soldier's uniform was his armor. Legionaries wore heavy armor of steel plates sewn into leather jackets. Their heavy wooden shields were rectangular and curved and fit together to protect themselves as a unit. And they wore metal helmets and chainmail, which were heavy, but meant the difference between life and death. These were men who survived on just 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. Each week they received a ration of wheat or barley, meat, cheese, salt, and sour wine. They could have their grain ground into flour to make a simple, bland, baked biscuit that traveled well. And with their salaries, they could also buy small amounts of apple or fish, oysters, olives, beans, honey, garlic, wine, and beer. And at the end of a long day, they went to their crowded barracks where they shared a room with a handful of other soldiers and their horses. Yes, soldiers were often housed with their horses in the same room to give them instant access if the enemy were to attack. In order to maintain the empire and impose Rome on its territories, soldiers undertook a range of non-military duties too. These could be within the fort or outside of it, like building Hadrian's Wall. For a soldier, it was good to learn a trade. Rather than cleaning toilets when they weren't fighting, they could learn to be a carpenter, a butcher, a cobbler, or a stonemason. And stonemasons were vital to this army. Permanent settlements needed stone buildings, and this involved creating relative trades like quarrying stone and clay and producing mortar for construction. We can see the tools and equipment they made and used, including personal items like combs and shoes. Some were even trained as medical orderlies, taught the basics of medicine to care for wounded and sick in the fort and on the battlefield. And they were also taught to read and write in Latin. Here we can see writing templates, ink pots, and actual pens excavated at the Vindolanda fort in England. These men were well-rounded professionals in every sense of the word. If they survived the decades of service, veterans were typically settled with fellow pensioners in less inhabited areas of the empire, and sometimes in veteran colonies within the provinces. This was often done as a means to Romanize a newly conquered area. Timgad is a Roman military retirement city in Algeria, North Africa. It was built by the Emperor Trajan in 100 AD, and as Roman expert Mary Beard once said, it looks as if it came from a Roman city-building kit, laid out in classic Roman grid-style street planning. We can still see the streets, the private living quarters, market sales counters, public toilets, and the city's entry arch. Soldiers would have retired here on their own or with their families. This, a military pension, and citizenship were the reward for decades of service. But the daily military drills, manual labor, and violent battles came at a personal cost. Surviving documents show many Roman soldiers suffered the physical and mental consequences of military life. During peacetime, the unrelenting training battles and manual labor often degraded their physical health. Many young men suffered from significant arthritis, which hindered their ability to simply walk and do everyday activities. Imagine being a 32-year-old man enduring sharp pain with every step you took, or not being able to lift your child because your 28-year-old shoulders were arthritic from a decade of carrying a 30-pound shield. Chronic pain and mental health challenges were often the price men paid for a chance at a better life. Records report a military leader once disciplined a group of his troops by making them spend the winter encamped on a hill at 6,000 feet with thin tents. When the harsh winter rolled in, some soldiers had limbs freeze and fall off, while others froze to death keeping watch. It was experiences like this that took a mental toll on men. Additionally, suicide attempts by those who became overwhelmed and retreated during battle were often known to occur. By the 3rd century AD, the army was dealing with attacks on all three sides of the empire, with declining manpower. This meant they simply weren't mobile enough to cope with these invasions. So often soldiers suffered deep-rooted anxiety and self-mutilated as a way to make themselves unfit for duty and receive early release. The average life expectancy for Roman soldiers was low, even in peacetime. Just under half would reach the age of 45, around the retirement age of a soldier. So the golden ticket of citizenship, a home, a pension, and retirement benefits may have been the goal, but it was more likely they'd die before reaching the 25 years of service required. And this brings us back to Hadrian's Wall and the nearby Roman fort of Vindolanda. When we think of the short and harsh lives these soldiers endured, their accomplishments seem even more impressive. Here we see the remains of Vindolanda, the Roman settlement and fort built by the army between 74 AD and 85 AD. At one point, it was home up to 6,000 people, and this included not only the army, but their wives, children, relatives, and veterans. The site has been under excavation in some form since the 1820s and continues even today. The fort sits just 13 miles from Hadrian's Wall in England. Since it was occupied for nearly 900 years, we can still see some of the everyday structures we relate to today, like front door steps, small rooms with fire hearths, ingenious heated floors, different types of hand-carved water drainage stonework, main streets, and so many small details that help us connect to those very soldiers who made them. And it's wonders like Hadrian's Wall and Vindolanda where we can appreciate the sacrifices of thousands of anonymous soldiers who spent their lives struggling for a better life and created something phenomenal in the process. This is one of the many lessons we can take away from our study of Roman history. In a world where many vie for celebrity and notoriety, it's the quiet, humble, hard work and sacrifice that create things that matter, things that stand the test of time.